For everyone joining now, we're just giving it a minute or two to let folks get settled in, and then we'll get started. All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's free CLE hosted by the Animal Law and Criminal Law sections of the Florida Bar. This is part one of a three-part webinar, which we are presenting this fall. My name is Scott Garcello. I'm an executive council member of the Animal Law section. Today's program offers an overview of crime scene processing, evidence collection, animal identification, and maintaining chain of custody when responding to animal cruelty or animal fighting cases. Presented to you today by Nathan Zylak, National Criminal Practice Counsel in the Legal Advocacy and Investigations Division of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, otherwise known as the ASPCA, and his ASPCA colleague, forensic analyst Jonesta Nolan. In his role, Nathan supports law enforcement and prosecutors in the investigation and prosecution of animal cruelty and animal fighting cases throughout the country. He is a former assistant state attorney in Florida's 6th Judicial Circuit and a longtime volunteer with the Pinellas Humane Society. With over 16 years of experience in the forensic field, Jonesta has held significant positions with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department, the Denver Crime Laboratory, and the Dallas Police Department's Crime Scene Response Section. She's a certified senior crime analyst by the International Association for Identification. Before turning the presentation over to Nathan and Jonesta, if you have questions, please post them to chat. If we have time at the end, we'll raise them with the speakers. I know Nathan has a section in between that he'll also ask for questions, which you can post at that time. At the end of the presentation, I'll provide the CLA code to everybody. With that, Nathan and Jonesta, the presentation is yours. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Nathan Zylak. Today, we're going to discuss evidence collection and maintaining chain of custody in an animal cruelty or animal fighting case. Sometimes when a warrant for animal cruelty or animal fighting is being executed by law enforcement, ASPCA or another similar organization will be on scene to assist law enforcement with the execution and removal of the animals. We'll go through how we do things at ASPCA and try to explain how evidence can be collected and chain of custody can be maintained when dealing with live evidence, being the animals. ASPCA deploys to scenes all over the country. When we do, we typically have teams of people who will respond, including but not limited to lawyers, veterinarians, investigators, dogfighting experts, forensic analysts, animal handlers, behaviorists, and transport drivers. The local law enforcement agency is in charge of the investigation. Outside agencies like ASPCA are there to assist them in that investigation. We also follow the incident command system, so everyone on scene has roles that we've identified ahead of time and a team lead. Today, Jonesta and I will walk through a simulated response to a warrant execution of a suspected dogfighting animal cruelty case and discuss how we collect evidence and maintain chain of custody in that process.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Jonesta and I work for the ASPCA as a forensic analyst. As Scott mentioned, I have about 16, 17 years working in human crime scenes. So as I go through this presentation, I'll often refer or highlight to the differences and similarities between human crime scenes and animal cruelty scenes. That kind of keeps things straight in my head. So the first step in any crime scene processing methodology is something that we call an assessment. Now, this assessment step begins upon the notification of case information. So as soon as we know that we have a case, that's when assessment begins. And it's prior to scene arrival. This is a vital first step and includes initial preparations based on the preliminary information that we receive. In cases where there is a warrant involved, we may have many days or many weeks to do this assessment. This entails going to meetings with investigative personnel. We go over maps of the terrain or the property. We review any photographs that investigative or law enforcement personnel have given us, including things like pictures on social media, things like that. We review a history of the property and we review the history of any subjects that may be investigated. A scene assessment is continuous. We go over this over and over again because details are constantly changing. Some of the questions that we ask during assessment are what equipment is needed. Some scenes need specialized equipment, like excavation equipment if we're going to be digging, or specialized tools. If there's going to be heavy chains that we need to cut, do we need to take bolt cutters? What type of terrain does the scene encompass? Because that can mean that we need specialized equipment, even getting to the scene. How many personnel are needed to process? Animal cruelty scenes are among the biggest and largest geographically wise that I've ever responded to. Sometimes there are many areas or many locations, several crime scenes, several acres that we have to do. So it would be more efficient to have multiple personnel. Remember that we are photographing, we're using videos, and we're documenting all of the scenes and every animal. So whether we have a dozen animal or hundreds of animals can really help us determine how many personnel that are needed to process the scene. Also, how many animals are on scene? That's also going to be something that we need to look at. What condition are these animals in? Are they injured? Are they living? Are they deceased? All of that is going to help us determine what type of scene that we're walking into. And will outside resources be expected or required? If we have something like farm animals or just maybe a species that I'm not personally familiar with, we may need specialists to come in to help process the scene. Finally, are there any unusual circumstances or dangers? Are there elevated ammonia levels, for example? Any structural damage? Any uncaged or aggressive animals? That's always something that is new to me working in animal cruelty cases. In human cases, the animals will all be caged or detained before I got on scene, and I never had to worry about that. Here, the animals are evidence. So if they are loose or uncaged or aggressive, that is part of the scene and something that I have to document and process when I get there. What about weather conditions? It always seems that crime scenes happen either in really hot or really cold weather. So we have to be prepared for that as well. Something else that comes up in the assessment process is who is the investigative lead? What agency is in charge? What expectations do they have of scene processing? Some agencies are very, very hands-on. They have their own crime scene personnel there to help, or some agencies simply have the one patrol officer there and they want us to do most of the work. And a lot of times we're working with law enforcement in addition to animal control agencies. So figuring out what everybody's expectation is part of the assessment process.
Let's say you've established probable cause for animal cruelty and dogfighting at a residence, and you get a warrant to get onto the property these animals, as well as evidence of cruelty and dogfighting. If you scan the QR code, you can pull up a sample generic warrant template for a dogfighting case. It's too much verbiage to put on a slide, but I did want to highlight one part of it. We like to see in there this language: all animals living, deceased, and unborn, above and below ground, and any subsequent forensic examinations of such evidence. We put all animals because you never know what you're going to find. You may expect to find dogs, and while you're there, you also find cats, goats, iguanas, or any other type of animal. We don't like situations where we find something on scene while executing a warrant, and then while on scene, someone needs to go leave and try to get in front of a judge to get a second warrant for something we didn't think to include. So we typically put all animals. We also may find deceased animals on scene, and they may be buried. So putting deceased and below ground in there ensures that we're covering that. We also put unborn because you may very well have pregnant animals on scene, and we want to make sure those puppies are covered when they're born as well.
One of the most compelling types of evidence in an animal cruelty case are the photographs of the scene of the alleged crime and animals in situ. So the ASPCA conducted a survey with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys, and over all of the different types of evidence that you collect on a scene, photographs of the scene and photographs of animals in situ were found to be two of the most important pieces of evidence when either deciding to prosecute the case or in the prosecution of animal cruelty prosecutions. So photographs of housing and environment are important, particularly due to the specific criteria that are usually associated with fighting animals. Fighting animals are generally isolated and kept in these yards that have a very specific look to them. It's very unique. So animals are housed on short leashes and they can see each other, but they can't actually get to each other. That kind of breeds aggression to where you can get to this animal, but you just can't quite get to them. As with any crime scene photograph, it is crucial to obtain photographs as they accurately depict the scene without any outside interference. This is why it is so important for crime scene investigators to be amongst the first personnel on scene, so we can document the scene as it appears as soon as we get there. The photograph on the left side of your screen is an example of dogfighting dogs, but this suspect did not have a full yard. He didn't have the acreage. So this is how they were kept in the basement of a building. You can see that each animal is housed separately, but they're actually stacked on top of each other throughout the entire basement. The pictures on the right are what are typical yards. That is typically what we see when we go to an animal fighting yard. You can see that the animals are kept, again, isolated. They can see each other, but they are tethered and can't actually have access to each other. You'll see small individual housing, and again, those animals are kept just out of reach of each other. Photographs of living animals can be tricky. Again, I talked about going into a scene and you may have uncaged or aggressive animals, but these are vital and they are super important. As a crime scene investigator, I have to balance the need for documentation and working quickly to rescue animals that could be in potentially hazardous conditions. We also do video documentation. That is something that we've gotten away from in human crime scenes, but on animal crime scenes can completely tell the story in animal behavior and environmental sounds. So the photographs on the left-hand side of your screen are chickens kind of in situ. Those are both apparatus used, the swinging rope, and then kind of the perch that they jump over. Those can be used for condition of the fight, to condition the chicken for fighting. And it's imperative to get that documentation as soon as possible. The photographs on the right are what we see a lot in animal fighting dogs. A lot of times suspects will use heavy chains or they will weigh the chains down. As you see in the middle picture, they use tires to weigh the chains down in order to condition or strengthen the dog for fighting.
Once Jonesta finishes her initial photos, I, along with our lead investigator, usually a veterinarian and behaviorist, take a walk through the property. We're trying to assess the species that we have, the number of animals, and if there are any priorities. Like if we see an animal in critical condition that the vet feels we need to prioritize getting them off the property and for emergency treatment. Once we finish the walkthrough team meets with the team leads to update our removal plan. We prioritize getting animals in need of urgent care off the scene first. In our sample scenario here, let's assume that we see 8 adult pit bull type dogs chained in the backyard, all similar to the dog at the bottom of the screen here, a chain affixed to a car axle on the ground, and they're individually housed, so each dog can't reach the other dogs within their chain space. Also on our property here, let's assume we see a chicken coop with 6 chickens inside, and then inside of the residence, we have 2 dogs inside of kennels, and we have 1 loose Chihuahua running around the front yard.
So part of my duties as a crime scene investigator, do photographs, do video, but also every scene gets a sketch. And this is an example of exactly what Nathan said is going on in the scene. So it gives a complete overall view of the scene, and it's super easy for us to see each animal and their ID number. An ID number is something that Nathan's going to go over later. But if you look over this sketch, there are 8 dogs in the backyard, which is I labeled as section 1A. There are 6 chickens on the right-hand side. Inside of the house, there are 2 dogs in crates or kennels, and there's a loose dog on property. Now, this is a basic sketch. I can get more detailed, and I usually do. When I go on the scene, I will do measurements for each and every crate or enclosure, and I will do measurements to each and every between each and every animal. So this is a very simplified sketch, but again, if there's hundreds of animals, each animal is very important to get measurements of the enclosure and measurements of their distance in the scene, especially away from other animals.
Once we have our scene labeled and we've come up with our ID numbers, we set up a shark tank, or what we call shark tanks, which are just temporary cages that we set up to work our LAD process in. LAD stands for Live Animal Documentation. So we set these little cages up where we allow some initial exams and some documentation to go on. Also in this process, we're setting up our transport vehicle, getting that onto the property and ready to start loading animals. After these shark tanks are set up, a handler will grab an animal and bring them individually into the shark tanks. If they are the first animal removed from section A, then that animal's ID is going to be A01. We can have multiple shark tanks set up and multiple animals removed at a time. The handler will tell the LAD team the ID number, and once in the shark tank, a veterinarian provides a quick overview of that animal to determine if there's anything critical that would require an emergency transport. The animal receives vaccines, and we start photographing that animal along with their ID number. We also put a collar on them that has their ID number as well. Within this lab process, we have an animal inventory list where they're going to document each animal that comes in, the ID number, species, sex, and anything else that they find relevant.
And I thought this was a perfect opportunity to show off my dog, Lady. But this is the way that we take live animal evidence photographs on scene. Now remember, animals are items of evidence. So just like we would put a photo placard next to a gun on a murder scene, every animal must be documented in exactly the same way. It's easier to keep track of 5 animals, but when you have 100 or hundreds of animals, this process is super, super important. So the first picture that we take is a picture of the dog in its enclosure. If it is enclosed, if it's loose, then this slightly changes. But we take a picture with the animal ID number right outside of the animal's enclosure, like I did with Lady here. And then the next picture is kind of like a mugshot. It has all the important case information, including the case number, the location, the date, and who photographed it. This kind of series helps us match the animal ID to the enclosure to the animal. So in case we get confused with lady being a Black German Shepherd, we can look back and very quickly determine that no, this was her animal ID number. After we do kind of her mugshot, we just get a real quick front and side of her. And we do that with every single animal on scene. Now, if there are serious injuries to the animal or something that we believe is going to change in transport, we'll prioritize documenting that on scene as well. But this is the very basic series of photographs that we get for every single animal on scene. So after we do that, after the animals have been documented on scene and they are now removed and in transport, we do something called post-removal photographs. These are unique to me because normally I'll go in and kind of take a general overall picture of the scene, but I have found that there's so much more evidence really inside of these enclosures that need to be documented. So the things that we're looking for are just general living conditions. So again, after the animal has been removed, we have full access to everything that they've been living in for however long they've been on the property. That includes food and water or lack of food and water, any urine or feces, or again, lack of urine or feces. As a lot of times you can tell diseases or if there's anything in the vomit or anything like that. We're also looking for things like comfort items like blankets or toys or bones or just anything. We're documenting 100% completely what their living environment looked like. This helps our vets go back and determine they did not have access to water or they did. And it helps them tell the whole story of the scene. We also document any conditions that appear to be the result of the removal process. So if we remove the dog and they spilled a water bowl, for example, that is also something that we'll document at this time.
In addition to photographs of the food and water that's available, we also want to make sure we're describing it, and our investigators will write reports as well. Is there enough food and water for the number of animals, the species, and the age of those animals? Is the quality of the water sufficient, or is it green and dirty? Can the animals access the food and water? For instance, is the bowl too tall for a puppy to be able to reach?
So when we're looking again at the overall environmental conditions of animals, we just thoroughly assess and record any aspects that can affect the animal's quality of life. As Nathan mentioned, is the area clean or can it be cleaned with relative ease? Something like ammonia levels, particularly in enclosed spaces, can help us document the amount of waste or general uncleanliness in the area. Ammonia is a byproduct of waste and urine in a scene. So typical ammonia levels for an animal shelter, just a regular animal shelter, should be under around 5 to 10 parts per million. That is the standard. You can definitely smell the ammonia level at about 5. I say at about 30 parts per million, your eyes are going to start to water pretty well. But I have responded to scenes where ammonia levels have been as high as 350 parts per million. You can imagine what that smelled like. It was not great. And high ammonia levels can severely impact the respiratory health of animals and humans. So being able to get that on scene, especially at the beginning of processing, is super important. We can document, and sometimes we even measure the amount of waste that is present in an area. Waste can tell a lot about diseases or illnesses within a population. The measurement we take on scene of the enclosures of every single animal can also help us document if there's enough space for the number and size of animals being housed. Generally speaking, animal fighting dogs are kept isolated, but in some cases, they can be crammed together in a space. So always getting the number of animals in that space along with the measurements will help us tell that story. So while the animals are being removed, that is generally when I move into evidentiary documentation. Proper documentation of physical evidence is crucial to any crime scene, but particularly in animal cruelty scenes. And that's the biggest difference I found coming over to animal cruelty, is that I didn't really know what was important. So accurate and thorough documentation can definitely make a difference. So again, we take meticulous photos, we measure and we sketch items of evidence potentially within the scene. For example, when we're documenting the chains that are used on animals, if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, that top picture is us. We take measurements of the length of every single chain. Whether we collect it or not, we're taking a picture of it, we're measuring it, and we also weigh them. That is super important and not something that I ever would have thought of, because if you're using a 50-pound chain on a 30-pound dog, that definitely tells a story. We take photographs from multiple angles to make sure that we're capturing the condition, any identifying features such as rust or wear marks that can tell sometimes how long that chain has been there. And when we compare that to a collar, maybe that can tell us maybe how long that dog has even been attached to that chain. Another critical aspect of evidentiary documentation can involve the proper handling of medications found on scene. That top left photograph is often how I see medications on scene. They're kind of everywhere, and there's a lot of them. These medications have to be sorted, individually photographed, and inventoried. We need to know how many pills are in each and every container. We do photographs of the bottles 360 to capture the label, to include the name, the dosage, the issuing pharmacy, and any identifying marks. That helps us trace the source and the purpose of that medication. Another thing that I had no clue about was the fighting pit. The pit itself, that is the arena in which the fights actually happen. Very rarely when you go to a scene, especially if you're issuing a warrant, is the fighting pit just out. Normally they are out like after a fight or during a fight, and then they're put away. But what if you happen to find one, they are a wealth of forensic evidence. They of course have blood, but one thing we don't think about is that these are vicious fights. So in it, you can also see teeth. That is what the top right hand shows, and even nails from animals that were fighting, and just pieces of them embedded in the carpet. And this is not something that they clean. They, keep all the blood there, they keep all the nails there. So very often during a processing of these, we'll be on our hands and knees kind of combing through the carpet to look for these pieces of animals. And we can definitely get DNA, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Once the animal leaves that shark tank process, a handler will take them to a transport vehicle and load them inside of the kennel in the vehicle. The handler places a piece of tape on the kennel that has the dog's ID number on it as well. We have a loadmaster assigned to each vehicle who fills out a transport manifest documenting that animal A01 went onto ASPCA vehicle number 1. Once the vehicle is loaded up, the loadmaster walks through the vehicle to double check that the animals in the vehicle match what's on the transport manifest. The loadmaster then walks to each of the LAD units and reconciles the transport manifest with the animal inventory list that's there. Once that's done, the loadmaster then obtains a time and dated signature from law enforcement and then the transport driver. The loadmaster then signs the transport manifest themselves and gives it to the driver. When the driver reaches their destination, which in our case is usually our main national shelter in Ohio, a representative from the Ohio shelter signs the manifest with the date and time, verifying that all of the animals represented on the manifest were received at that shelter. The shelter then has further forms for if the animal leaves the shelter. The ID number that we assign tells us a lot of information. And you can see on the screen here, this is a sample ID number from our mock case here. The first few numbers are our internal case number. We have a lot of cases going on at a time. We're constantly deploying. If we just labeled every animal 1A01, we would have 1,000 1A01. So we have our case number first. Then we put the area of the property, which Jonesta and our labeling team are going to set up areas of the property. And then the next number there is going to be which animal that was within that area. Now, when the prosecutor files a charge, more often than not, they'll identify which animal they're charging. So let's say the charge here is 4 counts of dog fighting, 2 counts of animal cruelty for the dog, and 1 count of animal cruelty for chicken. Well, they may, on the charging document, state that the dog fighting charges are for dogs 1A01D, 1A02D, and so on. And the cruelty charges may be for dogs 1A01D, and that loose Chihuahua 1LS01, and the charge for the chickens may be 1A03B. So those ID numbers themselves tell us a lot of information. Let's take, for example, 1A01D. I know just from that number that this animal came from area 1A on the property. I also know exactly which chain space this dog was in, which chain was attached to that dog, which exams pertain to that dog, which photos are of that dog. So I can identify that the chain that this dog was tied to was, say, 30% of his body weight. I can see photos of scarring on that dog, and I can match that up with the vet report and their scar charts that say the scarring was consistent with organized dog fighting for that specific dog. I can also track this animal throughout the case. I can see which transport vehicle he was on, who the driver was, when he arrived at the shelter, who received him at the shelter, and when all of this happened by looking at our animal inventory list and transport manifest. By doing this, we're able to ensure that chain of custody is maintained, the information is preserved for the prosecutor, and the defendant is being put on adequate notice of what exactly they're being charged for. Now, the animals themselves are evidence. So we have to be collecting and documenting that evidence. But collecting evidence from an animal is a little bit different than swabbing a surface for fingerprints. On scene, we've given them that unique identification number. We've obtained photos of them in their living environment that they were discovered in. We've also obtained close-up photos of them with the ID board. A vet has already taken a once-over look of them to determine if they needed to go for urgent care. And then they've been transported off scene to a shelter or similar facility. Once off scene, a vet conducts what's called a forensic exam. On scene, we're trying to move quickly and get these animals off scene and into a safe location. But once off scene, we can take our time and do a more thorough exam of those animals. A forensic exam is not like when you take your dog to the vet for their annual physical and they spend less than 5 minutes with you. They are doing a thorough exam of every single inch of that animal. They are photographing everything. They're doing blood work and other relevant diagnostics. They're eventually going to write a detailed report of all of their findings. They'll complete what's called a scar chart. I don't have an example of that in our presentation here today, but it will be kind of a cartoon drawing of the dog where they'll put little dots on that drawing, signaling where all the scars are. After these exams, we continue with behavior exams of the dogs, and evidence collection on these animals can take a few weeks to fully complete. For our case here, let's say that our vet determines that 6 out of 10 of the adult pit bulls have scarring consistent with organized dog fighting. One of those dogs has both recent and old wounds, and 5 out of 10 of these dogs were positive for Babesia gibsoni. And surprisingly, our Chihuahua did not have any scarring and did not have Babesia.
So while animals are one of the most important pieces of evidence on an animal cruelty scene, they aren't the only evidence. So we go through the scene looking for other evidence of cruelty or fighting, and here are a few things that we found in this case. So in the top left, that is what is known as a treadmill or sometimes a slap mill. That is used for conditioning the dog for fighting. You see that the chain with the collar in the front is where they attach the dog, and he basically runs. Sometimes they can run for hours. This is very heavy and very large, but it's often found on scenes where dogfighting animals are. If we go down to the bottom left, those are examples of what we call bite sticks. They are used to break up dogs who happen to be in a fight. So dogs, again, are conditioned to bite and not let go. So these are often used by handlers to separate the dogs. They will literally insert the stick into the teeth or jaw of the animal in order to break them apart from each other. If we look on the far right-hand side of your screen, the top picture is a fighting pit, all assembled and together. But remember, I said that generally speaking, you don't just come upon a fighting pit. A lot of times they will take that pit down. So what you will see is the bottom right hand, which are just slats, wooden slats along a corner somewhere. What is telling is that they normally have lots of blood stains that we can document and collect. In the middle is an example of a pedigree or breeding paper. Sometimes they're not that fancy, sometimes they're just handwritten. But breeding is super important in fighting animals. Animals who are bred from what are considered superior or champion dogs can be super valuable. So suspects like to keep breeding records for proof of lineage. Those are often very, very commonly found on animal cruelty cases. We will document those on scene and collect those if needed. One of the things that we look for when whether or not we should collect, because sometimes it's just enough to document. Sometimes we document and we process, but one is the item actually illicit? Is additional documentation needed and not possible on scene? Can forensic testing be performed on scene? Could the item be used for future illegal acts? Will the item be used as a courtroom exhibit? And consider the size. Can it be transported and can it be properly stored? Most importantly, why are you collecting it? We do a lot of documentation, meticulous documentation on scenes. Not everything gets collected, and every kind of item of evidence needs to go through that vetting process of, is it enough for us to process it here, or do we actually need this item of evidence taken and collected with us?
Often in dogfighting cases, you will find at-home medical kits and supplements. Surgical staples, sewing kits, antibiotics, red blood cell, steroids, and testosterone. Well, why is that? You can't take your scarred up dog to the vet. Even the winning dog often gets bloodied and severely injured. Fights can last for over an hour, and just like with boxing or UFC, even the winner can get pretty banged up after the fight. If they took their bloody dog into the vet would start asking questions and probably alert law enforcement. So they typically treat their dogs at home. Now, for most medications for dogs, they need to be prescribed by a vet, and vets typically require the dog be seen in the office before they can write a prescription. So how can a dog fighter get access to these medications without a vet? Well, livestock meds generally don't require a prescription. So you can go to Tractor Supply and pick up medication intended for horses, cows, pigs, or fish without a prescription. And that's exactly what they do. So let's say we find these two meds located in the residence of our suspected dog fighter here. They're both penicillin. If you look closely at the bottles, one says it's for cattle, swine, sheep, and horses, and the other has photos of cows, pigs, sheep, and horses on it. This guy did not have any cows, pigs, sheep, or horses, just a bunch of game pit bulls. So we need to make sure that we're documenting this and photographing the full label.
And this is one of my favorite parts of my job. My degree is in chemistry, so I love all of the testing and analysis that we can do. And any forensic testing that you're used to on human crime scenes can be utilized for animal cruelty cases. I was very surprised to learn that when I came to the ASPCA. For example, blood detection. There's a lot of visible blood on scene, but sometimes people do try to clean up. So anything that you use for latent blood, such as Blue Star or phenolphthalein, all of those work as well with with animals. So, and they can help us determine where fighting occurred, where injured animals have been kept, or even where deceased animals were kept. Any biological or trace evidence that can be DNA, saliva, semen, or hair, all of those can be found in animal fighting scenes. Again, these are vicious scenes, and we can look for humans or animal biological or trace evidence. Friction-rich development is what we call latent prints. Now, animals do not have a unique friction-ridge development, but if you're looking for suspects, and even though you have the warrant, maybe you're looking for partners or companions or whoever has been on that scene, we can also process items for evidence to help identify them. Now, we're going to go more in depth with necropsies and osteology, but those are almost always done as well on animal cruelty scenes. As Nathan said, you can't really take a dog to a vet all scarred up after he's deceased and ask for cremation. It's going to raise questions. So a lot of times, suspects will dispose of remains on their property. So when we go, very oftentimes we will find deceased or decomposed remains on property. So in this case, and this animal fighting case that we did find some bones in the yard. There are three questions that we typically ask when regarding deceased remains at a crime scene. We want to know, when did the death occur? Who do the remains belong to? And how did the death occur? We want that if it was human remains or animal remains. And fortunately, it is pretty easy for us to determine human versus animal. And there are some ways in which we can investigate deceased remains to help us determine what happened. After, again, meticulous photographs and videos, if there are deceased remains, the first thing we want to look at is whether or not we can do what's called a forensic necropsy. Forensic necropsy is just a detailed examination of an animal's body after death. Now, this is completed by a licensed veterinarian. It's not something that I can do or a typical crime scene investigator can do. It needs to be done by a licensed vet. It involves, again, the complete examination of an animal's tissues, organs, and body fluids. The purpose of a forensic necropsy is to help investigate criminal deaths. It is used to identify, document, and preserve everything on that body of evidentiary value. In a way, it is very much like me working an actual crime scene. Forensic vets take overall and detailed photographs, they take multiple measurements, and they collect items of evidence in a very meticulous and organized manner. This method will help them answer any questions that may be asked regarding that animal. So the overall goals of a forensic necropsy are to assist in determining the cause of death, the manner of death, any contributory causes of death, the mechanism of death, and to help estimate the postmortem interval. And much like a human autopsy, the forensic necropsy actually starts at the scene. Meaning findings in a necropsy can't be correctly interpreted without information regarding the history, crime scene findings, how the body was handled, how it was transported, how it was stored. Forensic veterinarians determine what they do at necropsy based on what they see on the scene findings. This is why it is so vitally important to have that close relationship between law enforcement, crime scene, and whoever is going to be doing any forensic examinations or necropsies on scene. Something that I did not actually recognize was how important osteological exams are. So again, remember, we're asking those three important questions about when the death occurred, who the remains belong to, and how the death occurred. But I found, law enforcement, I'm speaking for myself here, that I wasn't aware of just how significant skeletal analysis can be in animal cruelty cases. Osteological exams can be particularly helpful in animal fighting cases because of the tendency of animals to have more traumatic injuries. Unless animal remains are relatively fresh, necropsy can be difficult, if not impossible, on decomposing remains. In animal fighting scenes, again, you will discover completely skeletonized remains, often on scene. And even in a necropsy, when we do radiographs and CT scans, sometimes they're not always comprehensive or accurate. Some injuries are not perceptible through these types of imaging, either through the quality of the scans or maybe sometimes the angle of the body sometimes does miss things like fractures. So the remains that we found on this scene were too decomposed for us to do a forensic necropsy. However, we did do an osteological exam and determined that the remains belonged to one adult female dog. We observed some score marks or some scratching. You can see an example of that in the top right hand. You can actually see that on bone. It's like a scratching or score marks. We also observed she had a broken femur, very much like the fractured mandible that you see in the bottom right hand of your screen, and a single bullet wound to the skull. A lot of times we would see that with dogfighting dogs, especially if they lose. The owners will shoot them right after the fight. I found a really interesting picture I want to share with you guys that you can see a puncture from a dog fight in the face, the skull, right there. And you can tell that after death just using the skeletal remains. So just because you don't get a fresh body does not mean all hope is lost. There are other things that we can look at just using the bones there.
So in our mock dogfighting cruelty case here, while we're walking through the property for evidence, looking for evidence, we find jumper cables in the garage. Now, obviously, it's not a crime to own jumper cables, nor is it unusual to have jumper cables in your garage. However, especially in cases of suspected cruelty or dogfighting, if you find them, take a closer look. The jumper cables shown were found at the scene of a suspected dogfighter. If you look closely, you can see hairs on the clip. Not all dogfights are to the death. However, it is common that if the dog loses after the fight, the dogfighter will kill his own dog out of shame or humiliation for losing the fight. Sometimes they'll shoot the dog. The example we just discussed of the bones that had some consistencies with dogfighting and a bullet wound to the skull would be an example of that. However, another very common way the dogfighters kill their dogs is by electrocution with jumper cables. So if you see jumper cables on the scene of a suspected fighter, take a closer look. That hair can be analyzed to confirm that it was from a dog.
And because we're talking about DNA, I'm going to address a question from the audience from my friend Rachel Smith. She asked, does the ASPCA send DNA samples from every seized dog to the canine CODIS? Presently, we do collect buccal swabs, which is just like the buccal swabs you do on humans. I never thought. But we do collect buccal swabs on every living animal related to a suspected dogfighting case for storage and eventual entry into CODIS. And we do that in order for lineage purposes. So it's not like that we're doing it for the same reason we do for human CODIS, but we do it to connect bloodlines. More so is why we do that. That's a great question, Rachel. Thank you. So we're going to talk specifically about DNA and can we individualize or match DNA? And we very, very much can. DNA can play a crucial role in individualizing a specific dog seized from a property. We can collect DNA from various sources such as blood or tissue found in the fighting pits, saliva or blood from the end of a breakstick, or the root of any pulled hair left on the scene. So very much like human DNA. And any potential semen or other biological fluids from what is called a breeding stand. And I had never heard of a breeding stand before, but if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, that is an example of a breeding stand. They are often called rape stands where the female dog is kind of held down and strapped down. Again, these dogs are very aggressive towards each other. So in order to get them to breed, you really do have to tie one down. And that is what they look like. You see the kind of box shape for the head, and then the belt will go across her. And I've seen, I didn't think that I would use a lot of animal DNA, but we absolutely do. We work very closely with the only accredited lab in the country dedicated to animal DNA, which is UC Davis out in California. I've been on a scene where we've had a large amount of blood along the lower wall, along the baseboards of a room, and the owner insisted that it was his. He cut his hand and bled all over the bottom of the room. But we took several samples and was able to quickly determine that it was not human blood. And then we were able to, with the help of UC Davis, actually match and individualize the blood coming from several of the dogs that we seized off property.
There are a lot of statutes that deal with animals in Florida. And if you're new to laws related to animals in Florida, one place you can start is the ALDF website. They have a US map. You can click on Florida and they'll give you some of the most relevant laws that you're likely to encounter in your state. So in our scenario here, we have 8 chained up pit bulls in the backyard, each with heavy chains kept separated. We have a little chicken coop with 6 chickens in it. We have 2 pit bulls inside individual kennels in the residence, and we have 1 loose Chihuahua running around the front yard. We've discovered a deceased dog that's been buried. We have a bunch of fighting paraphernalia, and we have jumper cables with suspected dog hair on them. So what type of charges are we thinking about here? And I'd like if we can just have people plug into the chat some charges you're thinking about. Well, certainly dogfighting charges should be considered here. And there are several avenues we have under the statute. Simply owning or possessing a dog for the purpose of fighting falls under the statute. So does breeding and selling for fighting, as well as baiting and even maintaining a property for the purpose of fighting falls under our dogfighting statute. Our cruelty statute lists several different ways cruelty can be proven, and it defines torture, torment, and cruelty to be causing unnecessary or unjustifiable pain or suffering. So here we're mainly going to be looking at things like deprivation of necessary sustenance, untreated medical conditions, and whether there was any unnecessary pain or suffering associated with those. Your vet will be able to provide medical exams of all the dogs. The vet will give a body condition score for the dogs. For a dog, it's a scale of 1 to 9. 1 is emaciated, 9 is obese, 4 to 5 is ideal. In dogfighting cases, you'll find a lot of 3 out of 9s, dogs that are lean, kind of like a UFC fighter before a fight. 3 out of 9 itself won't support a charge, but a 1 or a 2 should be getting your attention. You'll also be considering untreated wounds and whether there was any unnecessary pain or suffering, which your vet can explain. You're considering the environment they were in. Were they standing in their own feces? Were there urine stains on their fur? Were the ammonia levels high? Did they have access to adequate clean water? There is a case out of North Carolina that found those environmental conditions can amount to torment under the cruelty statute. If anyone wants that case citation, you can reach out to me after and I'll get it to you. But that was a cat hoarding case where the floors were covered with urine and feces, and the court essentially said that forcing an animal to live in those conditions amounted to torment. Not a Florida case, but I don't think that that's a huge leap to argue that those types of conditions can amount to torment here. You can also look at 828.13, which applies to animals confined without adequate food, water, exercise, or change of air. In our case here, we also have a deceased dog and other factors that we can consider for potential cruelty charges. And let's not forget about our chickens. We didn't discuss today the environmental or medical conditions of the chickens that we found in our mock case. But can a chicken be a victim under our animal cruelty statute? Absolutely. Florida's cruelty statute defines an animal as every living dumb creature. There are a few cases that have worked their way through the court system to try to figure out what exactly that means. The Florida courts have specifically found that the cruelty statute applies to raccoons, opossums, and sheep. New York and California have a very similar definition of animal. New York has found that the cruelty statute applies to pet goldfish. California has found it applies to mice and rats in certain situations, differentiating between a wild rat invading your home, between a rat that's being bred for torture and crush videos. Chickens can absolutely be animals under the cruelty statute. And there are other statutes that deal with aggravated cruelty to cows and horses, and that's another topic. The main question, regardless of species, is whether there's an unnecessary pain or suffering. So generally, the issue with animals like chickens, cows, horses, and pigs will be that it's not cruelty if it's an accepted husbandry practice. So depending on the species, you may need someone with expertise in that species to discuss whether what was going on here was unnecessary or normal for that species. In summary, we need to make sure that we're planning properly. How many animals do we expect? What species do we expect? How are we going to transport them? Where are we going to transport them? What type of personnel do we need on scene? And what will everyone's roles be? Is everything we intend to do covered under the warrant? We need to make sure we're photographing everything. We need to make sure we're labeling so we can start and maintain the chain of custody. We need to make sure we're documenting the live animal evidence and maintaining those records with inventories and transport manifests. Finally, the forensic exams and documenting the evidence collected from the animals themselves. What Jonesta and I talked about today was just how we do things at ASPCA. That doesn't mean that your local agency does it the same way, nor does it mean they need to. This is just one way to do it to ensure that we're collecting the right evidence and maintaining that chain of custody. That's all we have today. Both my email and Jonesta's email are up on the screen. We'll be on here if anyone has any questions now. Certainly, if you want to reach out to us afterwards, or if you don't want to ask the question in a public forum, feel free to reach out to us after, and we'll try to address your questions as best as we can.
Nathan, there is a question. I like to talk, so I'll do it. We have someone that says they run a wildlife animal hospital. Sometimes a law enforcement officer will bring us animals that have been seized as unlawfully possessed by someone without a permit, or even those that have been injured in a cruelty case. Does my staff need to do anything special to document intake and care for court cases?
I think kind of a similar type of processes we talked about here, where you're taking the photographs, you're documenting everything. Certainly, if there's something specific that they're interested in for you to document, go ahead and do that. But I think the baseline photographs of, making sure you're photographing and documenting everything are kind of the minimum there that we want to be trying to do for sure.
And the ASPCA's Veterinary Forensic Science Center actually has grants that will help with any type of equipment you guys need. So if there's, you don't have great cameras, or if you need freezers or anything like that, we are here to assist law enforcement, and all of our services are completely free of charge. So if you have any contacts that need things, equipment for animal cruelty cases, please reach out to me directly. I'll be more than happy to walk you through that process. And we also are here for consulting. Nathan will answer any legal questions. Don't send those to me, but I will definitely assist with any crime scene or forensic questions.
Jonesta, I think this one might be more up your alley, but I have a question about documenting offspring of animals that have been seized. How are they counted as evidence? For example, if a dog gives birth at the shelter.
Yeah. And that happens so much. I think we just had a case where we seized, and the next day, all of a sudden, our numbers almost doubled because of the births. We do exactly the same thing. Of course, the forensic examinations themselves may be a little bit different, but we do still the same blood work. We get the same buccal swabs. We treat every item of evidence the exact same way. That is for standards and to make sure that we are being thorough. Because we collect it, we don't have to worry about later if we need it or not. But all of those puppies underwent forensic examinations the same way that the adults did.
I see a question about kind of general guidance for law enforcement. We do have an email for our investigators If you shoot me an email, I'll respond giving you that exact email address of who to contact there.
There's a question about whether we evaluate and place animals in cruelty cases for rehabilitation, fostering, and adoption. I'll let Nathan answer that one.
Yeah, so one issue is getting the ownership of the animals after these. So once law enforcement seizes an animal, unless they have surrendered that animal, they're still technically owned by that defendant, that suspect. So there's a legal process we have to go through, and that could be a whole nother presentation that we talk about with the disposition of the animal. But it's a civil process in Florida where you file a petition, you have a hearing, and you can get ownership of that animal. Typically, we're able to get that done within 2 to 4 weeks of the seizure. Once ownership has been established, then we can start getting that dog out adopted, and we try to do that as soon as possible.
Looks like Jody had a question about what is being done to ensure that agencies follow these protocols. Again, as Nathan said at the end, this is how the ASPCA does it. And after working in several very large agencies, it is the best that I've ever seen. I wish I had known about these protocols when I was working really big scenes, particularly with the way we label and document everything. I think it's like something I've never seen before. Fortunately, we have enough resources on scene that we can do this, but it is absolutely amazing what the ASPCA does on scenes. But we understand not everybody has the same number or procedures or policies. So we do things like this. We go out, we talk to people, and we try to at least give them resources. And again, we will assist in deploying or consulting for free. So if anybody ever needs us, we are there.
Nathan, Jonesta, was there anything else you wanted to add or address any other questions? I think we're at just past the top of the hour, so it'd be good to hand out the code for those who don't already have it, but the CLE code is 8587. And I think that you'll see that number in your registration emails, as well as section emails that come to you.
Just that Nathan's going to send that QR code with the warrant. He's going to send that to you guys, and hopefully you can send it out. Nathan, people were having trouble with the QR code, but I told them that you would send it.
The QR code, I can go back to it on the slide. Were people having a hard time, like it wasn't coming up when you scanned it, or?
It came up to something, I think it has a paywall on it or something. So maybe we can just send it out.
Oh,
yeah.
So anyone who is interested in a sample warrant, I have templates for dogfighting, for animal cruelty, for necropsies. If anyone is interested in getting a warrant template, email me. I'll send you whatever type of template you're looking for. If you have a template that you would like me or one of us to take a look at, happy to do that as well. But yeah, I'll absolutely be happy to review whatever you guys want and send you what you need.
That's great. Well, thanks, Nathan and Jonesta, for sharing your expertise, and thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you.
Bye. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Great job, Nathan.
Yeah, both guys, amazing. Thank you.